Hello, basement programmers. Are you new to AWS? Have you been playing around with AWS for a while, but now you're making the leap into serious deployments? Or maybe you're an active user with several deployments under your belt, but you aren't sure if you've got your foundation set up right. Well, stay tuned for my next video on AWS Foundations, featuring landing zones and AWS Control Tower, to learn all about getting your foundational environment set up right, or updating an existing environment to comply with AWS best practices. This video is sponsored by Kalent, rocket fuel for cloud adoption. Welcome to the video on AWS Fundamentals, featuring Control Tower. In this video, we'll cover a number of foundational elements that you should be aware of when it comes to getting up and running with a landing zone that is set up and configured with AWS best practices in mind. Now, pretty much every AWS customer gets started with AWS accounts in the same way. They head over to the account setup screen, they click a few buttons, enter in their credit card and an email address, and in a few minutes, they're clicking away in the console and spinning up services. AWS designs Landing Zone as a well-architected, multi-account AWS environment that is both scalable and secure. This means that the core setup is designed around AWS well-architected principles. There's more than one AWS account involved, and security is baked in from the start. Now, security is paramount. It's the first job, it's everyone's job, and it needs to be involved in everything that we do. This is one of the great parts about deploying a properly set up and configured landing zone. You can define security principles that apply organization-wide and have them automatically take effect with every AWS account that you create. This means that with a landing zone in place, your foundational security constructs move from being a cost to deliver to an upfront investment that pays dividends. Let's have a quick look at the history of landing zones when it comes to AWS. Back when I started at AWS in 2016, there wasn't a lot of prescriptive guidance for customers around multi-account strategy. Now, most customers went ahead and opened up an account and started building things. At some point, they would decide to open another account. This might be because they had more work, more teams, they ran into account level limits, or for whatever reason, they just decided they needed to open up another account. Well, at this point, the first level of pain kicked in because they started getting multiple AWS bills, one for each account. So customers would then have to either contact AWS support, or if they were large enough to have an account team, get in touch with their account manager and get consolidated billing set up. That was all that could really be set up when it came to multi-accounts at the time. Anything beyond that was manual, it was time-consuming, and quite frankly, error-prone. More accounts required more manual processing, involving support to get the extra accounts set up, or linked in for your multi-account billing. Things started to get difficult here, and because at this point, creating an account was still a manual process, every account had to be manually created, then added into your consolidated billing, and if you had organization-wide policies designed to keep you safe and secure, as you should, they had to be applied individually. Now, as your organization grew, so did the headache. Imagine this diagram once you start getting hundreds or even thousands of accounts. Now, multi-account strategy has been an evolution, and thankfully it has improved a lot over the last few years. As I mentioned, when I started, there was really no guidance. Now, working with large enterprise customers, AWS came up with the idea of the multi-account strategy. Initially, this started off as some internal documentation, and it was eventually published as an official white paper in 2021. This outlined the formation of best practices, including prescriptive guidance on what a well-architected landing zone should look like. Now, the good news here is we finally had documentation outlining what good was. We had a plan for success. However, the bad news is it was still all manually done. Setting up a well-architected landing zone took months between consulting work and deployments and configurations. After working with multiple customers to get landing zones set up, AWS professional services and a bunch of solutions architects came up with something that was originally called AWS Landing Zone. This was a set of scripts and CloudFormation templates that could be used to automate the deployment of a well-architected landing zone. It included much of the best practices automatically. When everything went well, the script shrunk the deployment time from 3 to 6 months down to mostly consultation time, and then a script that could be run in the background in a few hours. However, as I mentioned, Landing Zone was delivered as a series of scripts and templates. This made the process somewhat fragile and, quite frankly, unforgiving. If things went wrong, scripts could hang or maybe not complete correctly, and in some cases, you'd be forced to call up support to get things cleaned up. Now, don't get me wrong, Landing Zone was a huge step forward, but sometimes there were some difficulties. Also, being scripts, AWS Landing Zone required a high degree of technical knowledge about AWS before it could be deployed. Customers who just opened up their first AWS accounts were a long way away from being able to effectively use Landing Zone. In 2019, AWS launched something called Control Tower. Now, this was a managed service that did what Landing Zone did, only you could do it in the console rather than relying on scripts. Control Tower made AWS best practices available to new users in new accounts. Now, that's not to say you may not need help setting up Control Tower. Some customers want to do all the setup and configuration on their own, while other customers want to enlist an AWS partner to make things go smoothly and get everything set up right. The good news is, however, with or without a partner involved, Control Tower makes the process faster, easier, and much more reliable. Okay, so talked a little bit about what a landing zone is conceptually, and I've talked about the history, but what is it really? Now, when you start with Control Tower, you're going to get 3 accounts set up as your first step. The first account is your management account. This is the account that you start from. Control Tower is going to set up AWS organizations here. It's going to set up 2 organizational units, one for security and optionally one for sandbox accounts. Control Tower is then going to set up your 2 core security accounts. The first one's your logging account. The second one is your audit account. Now, your logging account is where your entire organization is going to forward all of their operational logs to. Why? Well, if one of your accounts gets compromised, the first thing an attacker is going to try to do is turn off your logging. The second thing they're going to try to do is delete any of the existing logs. Now, as we all know, when it comes to tracking down a security incident, the most important thing to have access to is good logs. So with this account, even if an attacker gets access to one of your other accounts and deletes the logs, you have a safe copy in this other logging account. Now, your audit account is designed to give your security and compliance teams read-only access into your other accounts. From here, they can investigate and review what's going on in the other accounts. Again, read-only access. This does not give them the ability to log into those accounts, and it certainly does not give them the ability to make any changes. Now, the management account has very few things set up inside of it, and for good reason. Best practices is you should never run any active workloads in the management account. What Control Tower sets up there should be it. Everyday users should never gain access into the management account. In addition to organizations, the management account contains a single sign-on functionality via IAM Identity Center. This was formerly known as AWS SSO, or Single Sign-On. AWS Service Catalog is also set up there to provide functionality around account vending, or setting up new accounts in your AWS organization. They'll automatically get wired up into your structure. Control Tower also sets up and configures all mandatory security controls at the top level of your organization and applies them to your entire organizational structure automatically, except for the management account. And this is one of the reasons why you should never run any active workloads there. The security controls include both preventative controls, things you never want anybody to be able to do, and detective controls, which is figuring out when something is going wrong or something is out of the ordinary. Now, if you want more details, I'm including a link to this Control Tower user guide here at the bottom of this slide. Once you have the basic Control Tower service set up, the next thing you want to do is look at what's called a shared services account. The shared services account is where you set up things that you would want to share across all of your other production accounts. Things like Active Directory, maybe your core networking infrastructure, and other functions that you would only want to ever set up once and then share. Shared services really becomes the heart of your organization from an operational standpoint. After you have your shared services account, you'll create additional AWS accounts based on the projects that you want to kick off. The exact structure of these projects accounts will vary from organization to organization. Oftentimes, individuals will have their own sandbox accounts to try things out and test things out. Projects will also get sets of accounts based on a project lifecycle. Now, some organizations will have a dev, test, staging, and production accounts that are shared across teams. Other organizations will have individual sets of accounts for each project. So every project might have their own dev, test, staging, and production account in this case. The exact structure will be something that you need to decide for yourself based on your needs as an organization and maybe your staffing levels and level of expertise within AWS. Now, I've seen customers with less than 10 accounts in the structure, and I've seen customers with over 1,000 AWS accounts. Again, all managed in this structure. It's up to you. Now, I've talked about the idea of organizations a few times. It's important to understand some of the power you get with AWS organization. Now, every organization starts with a root organizational unit. You can then have organizational units that represent aspects of your organization. The best practice here, align these OUs with the structure of how you work, not necessarily an organizational structure for leadership. For example, you may have an OU directly under the root that represents your operational capabilities. Now, this OU could be further divided up into OUs which represent things like development and production. You might have a sandbox OU, and this might be where individuals have their own accounts to test out new services and experiment. You might want to have an OU, for example, that represents dead accounts. These might be accounts where nothing should be happening, but you don't want to immediately delete these accounts yet, just in case you need to retrieve data. For example, maybe these are accounts for shutdown projects or for employees who have left the organization. You might impose a security policy here that denies any services from being turned on. With AWS organizations, you can attach security policies at each level of the organizational tree that affect all the accounts and OUs below it. For example, many organizations will have policies about the services that they will use. A service is allowed listed once the organization has a level of knowledge about the service, its configuration, and how they intend it to be used. These organizations will have policies at the operations OU that prevent the use of any service that's not approved for general use. However, in order to encourage experimentation, organizations will allow almost all services in sandbox accounts. Think of this like a stoplight with red, amber, and green lights. Red light services are not allowed to be used anywhere for whatever reason. Amber light services can be used in sandbox accounts or maybe in development. And green light services are cleared for use in production and anywhere within the organization. All right, so I can hear you thinking, that's great, but what about my existing accounts? The organization that Control Tower creates becomes your main organization. Additional accounts that you may already have in use can be ported in as well, bringing them under the umbrella of your organization. Just one thing to be aware, however, is that once an account is joined to an organization, it becomes governed by the OU structure where it resides. This includes the security policies that are applied at the OU level. Because these policies are enforced by the organization, they cannot be overridden inside the account. For this reason, some customers will have an OU specifically for legacy accounts that have very open policies. This should, however, be a temporary stopgap while you migrate workloads out of those legacy accounts into a properly governed account, because you don't want to leave an organization policy wide open permanently. Here are a few of the benefits of using Control Tower. First and foremost is security. You can automatically manage both preventative and detective controls across all of your account. Preventative controls like nobody should ever be able to open an S3 bucket. Seriously, please don't ever do this. I know some people may think it's okay in specific cases, but in the past 7 years, I have never seen a valid use case for an open S3 bucket, where there wasn't a better way to achieve the end result. You've also got detective controls, such as a user who may be logged in from another part of the world when they're normally asleep might want to cause an alarm to go off. Account vending is another huge benefit. Now, when a development team wants to have a new set of accounts for a new project, you can have Control Tower vend out the new account, pre-configure it with all of your policies ready to go. No longer do you have to manually create an account and then go in and run configuration scripts and get things set to go. And single sign-on that allows you to have one identity provider, one login, and access across multiple AWS accounts, all tightly governed. So how do you get started with Control Tower? It's easy. You can get started with Control Tower today by finding it inside the AWS console. Just type Control Tower from the main search window. Be aware that you really want to spend some time planning out your structure before you dive into the actual configuration. This will help you make sure that you have a structure that you can live with. For best practices, I recommend checking out the documentation about Control Tower on the AWS website and reading the multi-account strategy white paper. This all sounds a bit complicated. Don't worry. Kalent, the company I work for as my day job, has a Kalent Catalyst ready to go for helping you get up and running with Control Tower. Catalysts are predefined engagements that help customers get up and running fast. The Catalyst contains a workshop helping you define the way you want your deployment to work, along with time for Kalent's delivery staff to actually deploy Control Tower in your accounts for you. Kalent's Control Tower Catalyst is focused on delivering value to customers quickly and collaboratively. With Kalent's work with model, your team will work with the delivery team to skill up while delivery is in progress, ensuring that you're ready and able to take on and carry on with the next steps. I always tell my customers, we want you to come back to Kalent because you want to, not because you have to. Now, the Catalyst starts with a security workshop where Kalent's delivery team understands your needs around security, structure, and operating environment. Kalent will then set up guard duty in your account, covering your account with AI-based monitoring of all resources to spot activity that may be out of the ordinary. CloudTrail will be set up and configured, giving you an audit trail of everything that happens within your account. KMS will be set up, allowing you to use encryption for all services that support integrated KMS encryption, which is most of the services that store data. Kalent will also help you define your IP address strategy. Now, this strategy is important so that you know you have IP addresses reserved for all of your cloud-based needs and infrastructure. This is important because you want to make sure that your IP address space does not overlap with your on-premises network. Otherwise, you're going to have problems later on down the track. You're going to want to get your identity and access management also set up. This will be governed through AWS's Identity Center. This, as I mentioned before, was previously called AWS Single Sign-On, so you may hear people use those terms interchangeably. Another critical aspect of the Catalyst is setting up your tagging structure. Now, tagging helps you identify the purpose of various services as you spin them up. With tagging, you could, for example, start to build out things like showback or chargeback accounting. It also helps you build cost controls into your AWS environment. Finally, Klant will not only deploy Control Tower into a development environment for you, but they will help you to deploy it into your production accounts. As I mentioned, we always want you to be ready to carry on with what's been delivered after we leave. And the best way to do that is with hands-on practice. All right, thanks for watching this episode. You can find me here. Comments and feedback are always welcome. Complete source code for all of my videos can be found on GitHub. You can find me there at github.com/basementprogrammer. Thanks for watching my video. If you found this video helpful, please hit the subscribe button. It helps you to know when I have new content out, and it helps me to know I'm creating useful content for you. You can always find me at basementprogrammer.com, on Twitter, and the Basement Programmer podcast. Details listed here. If you have any comments on this video, or you just want to get in touch, you can always email me. The address is tom@basementprogrammer.com. And I'll see you next time.